Howdy, partner, and nipples for men. Is this thing live? And welcome to the latest Abraxas brief. I don't even know what episode this is. I guess I better get on top of it. I think I'm seeing, and right now nobody is populating the, there you go. People are starting to populate the inner sanctum of Gnosis, as this is a Facebook Live of the Abraxas brief. And then, yes, I already said nipples for men there, Donovan. Hope you heard it. But this is the Abraxas brief, and we will have the partial one. And then the complete episode was, of course, be for people in the inner sanctum of Gnosis and members of the Archive and patrons, whatever you want to call it. So I see people are starting to come in now to the group, and glad everybody is here. So I do hope everybody had a good holiday season and you're ready to shine your light even harder in 2019. I know I'm going to do my best. And first, I'd like to say I really appreciate the support. I appreciate you being here. Despite all the challenges and changes in 2018, the one thing that went really well was actually Aeon Byte and this whole venture. Not exactly the first half of the year, but 3/4 through, around October, November, everything spiked up all of a sudden, from donations to support at Patreon, membership, listens, traffic, everything went up in November. So it was really nice to see that. I'm sure a lot of it had to do with expanding to Heretics Anonymous, the Abraxas brief, and so forth. Yeah, things went really well. So I'm really appreciative of that. I'm really appreciative of your support. And again, another reason, as I contend, is these are Gnostic times. This is a Philip K. Dick world, as I've discussed before on other shows, many times on the podcast, and a previous Abraxas brief too. As well. Yes, nipples for men. So everything was going well. In fact, at this level, I was starting to think, my God, could this be the time where I can finally take this venture full time instead of having a day job? Everything was pointing that way, and that, of course, would mean a lot more content out, a lot in all forms, videos, podcasts, Abraxas brief, Heretics Anonymous, blogs, everything. I could do this full time and really get that Gnostic heresy out for the group. And then the Archons laughed, or the Demiurge laughed, because just recently I have had especially in Patreon, or pretty much in Patreon, a big hemorrhaging Hammurabi of patrons that have left, and the reasons have been pretty obvious. Let me make sure everybody's saying everything. The reasons are pretty obvious because they've let me know. I think a lot of people who are on Patreon are upset about the whole Sargon of Akkad and Jordan Peterson, David Rubin stuff, and that whole exit. And at first I thought in December, well, what does it have to do with me? I'm not a political commentator. Definitely it would have nothing to do with me, but it's beginning to affect me as people leave Patreon in droves, and they tell me the same thing. They tell me, well, Patreon has become a place of censorship. We're moving away. We're not happy with it. So we're splitting, and they've told me this via emails. And as well, I look, when patrons leave, I'm finding they're not even keeping up their pages, just completely deleting. And I guess it shouldn't be this much surprising, because one thing for sure about this venture is that it does appeal to a wide range of people. I mean, I have been contacted from all extremes, from alt-right individuals to left, very socialist, communist, you might say Antifa supporters. So, and that shouldn't be surprising. I mean, Gnosticism does appeal to many. As in these modern times, many do feel we are trapped. We are in a prison by higher powers, and that wickedness in higher place. Whether that wickedness is our politics, our government, or spiritual things, the Gnostic vibe definitely appeals to all these groups. So if one group is angry and leaving Patreon, well, it's going to affect the show. And unfortunately, I have lost quite a bit of subscribers, and it continues. But such is life. Again, the Archons have their sense of humor, and we just have to continue putting on content and hope for the best. So on your side, again, I really appreciate it. But if you could spread the word, get it all out, even if something like shares, mentioning to others really does help. So we can, again, I can get right the Aeon Byte ship again and get back on trying to increasing funds, and therefore, again, increasing the content I spread to thee. So that's my little public announcement. Good to see everybody here. It's always great, the inner sanctum of Gnosis. I was thinking, man, there has not been any kind of, as far as I know, conflict or friction with the group in over a year. Everybody at the group really gets along, and that's good to hear. Everybody's respectful of each other. I know I belong to other groups, and at least once a year there's always big fights and sometimes a big exodus, like what's happening with Patreon. So great to hear, great to know, and great to know you. So why don't we now get to the topic at hand? And I wanted to address this because, well, it needs to be addressed because even today, especially in today, there are a lot of misconceptions about the Gnostics, and certainly a lot of misconceptions about Gnosticism in general. So I'd like to briefly address it here. And of course, then I'll ask some questions if I miss anything, and you guys let me know. All right. So of course, maybe about 2 episodes ago, I did deal with the topic where the Gnostic world haters, did they hate the body? And I did address it. So you should definitely take a look at that one. It's here on Facebook, but also on YouTube, and it's also on Patreon. But I wanted to add a little bit to that, and of course, summarize again. What I ended up saying is that it was a yes or no. The Gnostics simply saw reality as what it was, which was a place of tension, a place of conflict, and a place where the light and the darkness were sort of trapped and fighting each other and trying to find their places. They also saw nature ultimately as a neutral thing, as an aspect of the universe that had its own agenda. And that didn't mean this agenda would be benign to humanity or really any sort of animal. And eventually was, you might say, a machinery where there was prevalent suffering from animals to humans and so forth. So that's how they saw. And it's interesting because, again, the Gnostics never saw the body as sinful or, the body is something sinful. Not at all. Again, to the Gnostics, it's always going to be simple. And the Gospel of Philip says this: the greatest of all sins is ignorance. Not knowing, not realizing, not understanding is the sin. Can the body be a vehicle of ignorance? Well, of course, it certainly can. So it's because, again, it was temporal. It's tricky because the mind is a tricky place. I always like what Richard Smoley said, that Hermes was a trickster god and also the god of the mind and the god of reason. And this was no accident, because our mind definitely can be itself a great vehicle or ecosystem of ignorance and misunderstanding. That's simply how the mind works. Our minds are trickster gods at the end of the day. And then when you add that to our bodies, who are temporal vehicles and will fail us and will bring us down, there you have it. But again, in itself, the body, nature, and all that is not sinful or evil or anything like that. Again, it's what takes us, what gets us in and out of ignorance. And something I didn't mention in the last one was that the Manichaeans, let me back up on that one. I also should have mentioned too, I remember in our first ever Aeon Byte interview, Robert Price did mention how when you read the Gnostic text, there is an amazing joy, there's a giddiness, there's a complete happiness when you start reading their texts between the lines and a lot they say, because they were transformed. They saw themselves as Christian bodhisattvas. They had been transformed. They were no longer under you might say, the fog of ignorance, or as the Gospel of Truth says, the fog of error. And they saw reality as it was, and they saw a lot of joy inside nature, inside reality, but also outside as they make contact with higher forms of consciousness. So there is a giddiness and a happiness to very much the Gnostic text. It's not all doom and gloom. And in that past video, also discussed why their myths was so dark and visceral and so forth, which is actually pretty normal with a lot of creation myths. But one thing I did think I missed was the idea of the Manichaeans. The Manichaeans, who are known as history's great emos, history's great negative sect. I mean, the term Manichaean itself means sort of down and dualistic and all that. I mean, even the writer of the James Bond novels, what was his name? I'm having names. Somebody in the group can tell me what his name? Ian Fleming, sorry about that. Ian Fleming, who was obviously a big occultist. He called James Bond a Manichaean because the original James Bond agent was very dualistic. He was black and white, and he was very surly. He really had no capability of joy in everything. What he did, gamble, drink, have sex, those were just things he used to get to the end of the mission, which is whatever the crown wanted. Having said that, the Manichaeans, when you look at some of the behavior of the elect, are probably one of the most eco-friendly groups that ever existed, right there with the Jains of India. The Manichaeans also believed that God was in every blade of grass, and they would try to avoid walking on grass. They waited, and we're talking about the perfect here, not the hearers. They believed in just waiting for fruit to fall down from the tree. They were vegetarians, they were pacifists, and when you look at their art, they did some beautiful art, beautiful hymns from what we hear from historians. So these dark Gnostics were far from it when you saw how they expressed themselves. And as I mentioned before, the Gnostics were really always beloved in their communities, whether it was the Manichaeans where they went, the Cathars, of course, were beloved. They were always respectful and kind. Valentinus was probably a very upstanding, respected member of the Roman Church. And only later was he sort of deemed a heretic, you might say, in retrospect. Basically, Irenaeus and those cats decided that Valentinus was a bad guy. And, something I wanted to mention, too, and this is an insight from Judith Mann. She's a past guest, no relation to Michael, but Judith Mann, she's written about the Cathars extensively, very much from more of an occult, New Age side. And it is true, because I checked today, when you look at some of the artwork of the Cathars, like 13th century, right after they started getting wiped out in southern France, you notice that they had big hands in these drawings. You've got like pictures, and the Crusaders are like kicking their asses, and there's the Cathars, but they've got big ass hands. Well, what does that tell you? I think in art, whenever you depict somebody with big hands, well, it doesn't mean they had something else big down there. No, it actually means that they were healers. They were natural healers. So what seems to be happening is that the Cathars were working with energy healing and so forth. So again, this kind of takes away of these Gnostics being these darksome, again, emo groups. They're always in the shadow. They were out there healing people, which is what seems to be what the Cathars were doing. So I like to put that out of I'd like to address this misconception. I was going to call this Gnostic myths, but then I feel like I'm using the word myth wrong, because this day and age, the word myth has been changed to appear like some sort of like a lie or an exaggeration. And I don't think that's by error. I think it's terrible that we've changed the context of what a myth is, and our culture is losing that, because again, well, he who controls a language controls culture, as Philip K. Dick said. So I decided to call it Gnostic Misconceptions. And here we are, me dealing with them. Maybe I'll do a show on what the power of myth is. So anyhow, that is one, again, touching on that the Gnostics were world haters. Please check out the other video of the Abraxas brief where I fully deal with it. Another thing I wanted to address, which has come up, is that the Gnostics have been accused of being anti-Semitic. And this is something I've had to deal with throughout the years. I don't deal with so much because this was something that evangelicals used to say, and evangelical priests or pastors and so forth, and scholars. They would say that the Gnostics were anti-Semite. And then, of course, the new atheist movement sort of grew and started attacking them. So they had to shift as the new atheist movement became more popular, and the Gnostic churches were just sort of putt-putting along and so forth. And I have discussed this idea about Gnostics being anti-Semitic in other shows, like with David Bracke and so forth. Now, but it's a good thing to address now, because in this day and age, it seems like sometimes everything's anti-Semite. Being a globalist is an anti-Semite, or whatever you call it, the dog whistle thing, which it's a silly term because dog whistling simply means marketing, right? Whether you're selling soap or anything, you're going to use the keywords to address your audience. That's just been going on since the dawn of time. But now it's supposed to be a nefarious thing, even though all companies, brands, politicians, religious leaders are supposed to use dog whistles, or you can't communicate with anybody. So, but back to the anti-Semite thing, and as David Bracke said, that makes absolutely no sense for two reasons. And of course, Stephen Heller, I've discussed this with Stephen Heller as well, Robert Price, and other people who know their manure, their shiitake mushrooms. When it comes to the Gnostics, yeah. Ooh, vanilla. First of all, there is good evidence that the Gnostics, or many of the Gnostic sects, certainly the ones in Alexandria, probably started out as Jews dissatisfied with the corrupt Second Temple culture that was in the pocket of Putin. Oh, I'm sorry, in the pocket of the Romans. And they had decided they were just going to break away. They were Hellenized. They were tired of the nonsense coming out of Jerusalem. They thought the message had been corrupted, and they were going to go do their own thing. In April DeConnick's The Gnostic New Age, which of course I always like to recommend because it's the latest and greatest book that really exemplifies the Gnostics, she talks about how a lot of these Jews and even Greeks and so forth went to Alexandria. They met these Egyptian gurus, these Tony Robbins. I've talked about this before in the Abraxas brief. And they decided, and they basically sort of fused Judaism with the ancient Egyptian mysteries and so forth. And lo and behold, we got the Gnostics and the Hermetics and so forth. So basically the Gnostics, probably many of them were originally Jews who decided they were going to go their own path, the mystical path, the heterodox path, the Hermetic path, and so forth. And as David Bracke also says, that the Gnostics were obviously obsessed with the Old Testament. I mean, fully obsessed. Nobody that obsessed with Jewish scriptures would have been not a Jew, or even come close to disliking the Jews. I mean, that's just silly. They saw a lot of holiness and insight, I think, in is it the Secret Book of John, or one of those original Gnostic texts. They talk about the book of the prophets, and we got to obey the prophets and all that. So to them, the Old Testament was essential, and they were just doing, you might say, they were one of the first to do Rabbi Midrash. They were looking at, you might say, the spaces between the texts where they could find stories that perhaps had not been told, and align those with myths and the folklore of the time and the legends of the time. Now, again, they were doing just doing the same exact thing that you see with rabbis throughout history. And as the Secret Book of John says, it's not that the Old Testament is wrong, is that Moses got it wrong. When he got the visions and all that was given to him, he just simply got it wrong. He got the wrong interpretation, or he might have been working for the demiurge, I think. And Paul says in Galatians that it wasn't the higher power that gave him the Torah, but it was angels. So, of course, many Gnostics said, well, in those days already, there was a very much a dissatisfaction and suspicion about angels. So maybe, as Paul is intimating, that Moses just got it wrong, and the Gnostics certainly ran with it. And they went ahead and got their own stories and decided they were going to look and find new meanings in the Old Testament, in these Jewish texts. It was, again, very important to them. And with Paul too, Paul seems to be rewriting a lot of things and reinterpreting the Old Testament in very radical ways. Nothing controversial. And hey, Paul happened to be a Jew too, and he was probably a quasi-Gnostic, and he's certainly the foundation of many of the early Gnostics, like the Valentinians and some of the Sethians. So the idea that the Gnostics were anti-Semite is just silly. If anybody brings it up, address it this way, or I think my book, Other Voices of Gnosticism, has the transcript with David Brackey. I think it has a transcript with Stephen Heller where we might address it, and I can give you some more pointers. So, but in this day and age, such silliness is, I mean, if there was open-minded people, it would have been the Gnostics. I mean, they were fascinated not just by the Jewish texts, even if they didn't start out with Jewish, but they were really fascinated with all religious texts. They just interpreted things, and they were finding insights. And of course, finding insights got them in hot water with the Neoplatonists, because the Neoplatonists, they believed in using these old myths like Plato did, and using them as teaching tools. Like, this is why Zeus did it. This is why Apollo. There's that hidden meaning from these very caveman myths, these very visceral myths and rough myths where the gods are, well, they're basically representing the more base sides of human nature. The Gnostics took it one step ahead and actually started changing the myths. They said, well, in this story, Zeus actually did this. There's a gap in the story, so we're going to say that he did this. They use sort of that rabbinical style to the Greek myths and the Roman myths, and that really pissed off Plotinus and so forth. But that's what they do. Hell, that's what we do today, right? We create our own myths. We find the gaps, and we create fan fiction from the Batman, Superman stories, and all our gods wearing spandex, as Christopher Knowles might say. So, but we'll leave it at that. Oh, and one more thing, which is very interesting. You have the arguments between Origen and Celsus or Celsus, and they're of course arguing about Christianity, and one saying Christianity is the one true religion, and Celsus is saying no, Christianity is just it's crap, whatever. There's only one thing they agree on. Both actually say that they cannot believe that they would make the God of the Old Testament as the villain in the cosmic play. Even Celsus, who's a pagan, to him these texts are holy, and these creator gods all are holy and are important for the structure of the cosmos. So the Gnostics are they're out of line. They're just going way out of line. Of course, Origen believes that. But again, another example why the Gnostics just had to push the limit and often take a piss on the limit, because that's just what they do. And that's what they do throughout history. And that's how they get in trouble, even if they're actually very nice, upstanding people. So I've dealt with that. A little more of this vanilla. The other number 3, what we're dealing with, and that is the Gnostics believed in a utopia. Now this comes again from also right-wing polemics. You can find this in, sometimes you'll get this in National Review and other neocon places, and it's based on the work of Eric Voegelin, who was a, I'd say, theologian, philosopher, early 20th century. But he decided, very pre-Nag Hammadi library, and really very bad scholarship, he decided that the Gnostic ethos was all about creating a utopia on earth. That the Gnostics basically believed that if we can't get up to heaven, we will bring heaven down upon us. If we can't reach God, we will make God here, and we will become gods ourselves. The only problem with his research is that he assumed that becoming gods meant ruling gods. And in fact, Voegelin went as far as to say that the Nazis, the communists, all the bad guys of the 20th century were indeed crypto-Gnostics or were influenced by Gnosticism. And even today, it comes out in these right-wing publications about whenever they want to find a boogeyman or something they don't like today in politics or whatever movement, they'll bring up the spirit of the Gnostics. Oh, these Gnostics are worse than the Freemasons. Are always trying to become gods and rule over people and create some sort of utopia on this planet by changing humans, by transforming human beings into this hierarchy of gods and will rule over them. Needless to say, that is just all BS. I mean, one thing we can easily say is that the Gnostics were always, well, there's a couple of exceptions, but Gnosticism itself is apolitical. I mean, that's just pretty much just by reading the text. I mean, what does anarchism really mean? Anarchism, as I've said before, means without archons. And the Gnostics certainly believe that they did not want any archons. They didn't want any princes. They didn't want any rulers. They didn't want powers and principalities, or at the very least, these structures and what they represented were bad for society in general. So the Gnostics were apolitical. You have two exceptions. You've got, as far as I know, you've got Bardisan, which was a Gnostic in, I believe, the late 1st century. And I believe it was Edessa or Syria. The king actually adopted him as his advisor, and the kingdom there actually became Gnostic for a short time. I don't know, 10, 20 years, but nothing was really implemented, because how do you implement Gnostic politics on something? You know, hey, you've got to, I don't even know what they would do, because it just doesn't transfer to Gnosticism. I'm sure that we can make all many jokes about this. Second part, the second exception is, of course, the prophet Mani, who became main advisor for the emperor of Persia, the Sasanian dynasty, toward what, the 3rd century, end of the 3rd century, 2nd century, yeah, something like that. And that was because, as Jason Reza Jorjani has posited, the emperor was, the Persian Empire was expanding. It was very powerful, very cosmopolitan, very multicultural. So the Persian emperor wanted basically an enlightened, pacifist, reason-driven religion that could work for all people. And again, as I said at the beginning of this vlog, Gnosticism in a way does appeal to so many different races, political strata, affiliations, and so forth. The idea that we can make a connection with the divine, that we are divine, that we can break through all the false realities of our life, that such thing as philosophy and pacifism and all that can really help us grow as human beings, and so forth. So it was very, it was definitely very appealing to the Persian emperor. And Mani was used to bring this, you might say, new cosmopolitan, multicultural religion to the world. But things didn't work out. The emperor died, and the one who took over was influenced by Putin. I mean, the Persian priest, the Zoroastrian priest, so Mani he died a gruesome death. So anyway, and even, I keep talking about becoming God, but this is an alchemical transformation of the individual. An inner transformation. They're not really gods that we can rule others, or that we're even superior to other human beings. That's silly, and it's not in any Gnostic text. Yes, there are some of the later ones, some of the later ones like Marsanus or Zoroastrianus, where the adept or the Gnostic sage suddenly can control angels and other beings from the cosmos, but this control has nothing to do with translating it into some sort of worldly change or economic change or political change. Again, it's always about the transformation, the healing of the mind, and the nurturing of the divine spark. So if you see anything in those places about the Gnostics wanting a utopia on earth, no, I don't think the Gnostics would ever even, no, I think the Gnostics would say the world is lost. Nature's going to do what nature's going to do. Politics is going to do what politics are going to do. And the best we can do is just transform ourselves and express this transformation and help the least of our brothers. So you don't have to worry about the Gnostics ever wanting a utopia. Whoa. Just got this new jewel. Man, it packs a kick. I've got the kids' Yoda glass. Real quick, my God, time really flies. The other thing I wanted to also address, but this has been pretty much addressed, is the Gnostics being sort of, you might say, feminist lover pagans. And this thing, I think, is still a big misconception out there. I personally would never consider myself a male feminist, probably because every time I looked at the media, some male feminist ends up being a real womanizer or a seducer or predator under the radar and so forth. And of course, I have a lot of issues with modern feminism, but I think, like with the Gnostics, I do believe in the truth. I believe that a lot of truths have been suppressed, they've been squashed, and I do believe in a world of balance and individuation and completion. So, and I think, as I just said, the ancient Gnostics would believe the same thing. When you look at some of their texts, yes, they do appear to be very egalitarian in all their views. I mean, we can look at was it the cult of Marcus the magician in the 2nd century, where he is taking, he had his coven of, you might say, witches, and they're rolling dice and so forth to see who's going to be the priest one week, who's going to be the deacon, who's going to sit in the pews, or who's going to give baptism. And of course, you have the switching around where men can be here. It doesn't matter what your social status is. Women can be the bishop one week and so forth. You do get a lot of instances of this very egalitarian sort of vibe. But at the end of the day, the Gnostics wanted restoration, and they wanted balance, and they wanted the truth. That's why they really brought up Sophia. They saw, again, we're going back to the Jewish text, they saw that in certain sections there was a divine feminine figure, wisdom, that was with God at the beginning of time and was sort of a co-creator, or at least companion. Then they saw later in the Jewish text that suddenly this wisdom was lost with us, lost down here on earth with human beings. I guess the Jews would call it the Shekinah of God. And so they simply said, well, there was probably there was this wisdom goddess. And of course, culturally, throughout history, wisdom is pretty much always going to be a female deity, because women are the ones who historically are the carriers of wisdom and so forth. I guess Thoth would be an exception, right? But for the most part, there were women. So, of course, they saw this lost Sophia out in the world, and they wanted to restore the wisdom of God and restore our own wisdom, and all unified and all together. And they came up with their myths, the fall of Sophia, the Logos, she loses her partner, and some of the myths, she is Jesus, some she's else. But again, you've got this interplay of Logos and Sophia is lost in the world. Humanity lacks Sophia, and that's why we're stuck here down on the ground, and we can't seem to get up. So I don't think you could call the Gnostics feminists or nature-loving pagans, obviously, because of how they saw nature. They saw divinity in nature, but they certainly did not worship it, and they never would. I guess lastly is, God, man, time really flies. So I hope you guys are having fun. But the last one is, of course, that Gnosticism never even existed. And this is an argument that happened more or less early in the 20th century. No, early in the 20th century, late in the 20th century, early in the 21st century, by such individuals as Karen King, Michael Williams, even Elaine Pagels for a little bit. And that's that there was no such thing as the Gnostics, that they were simply Christians with their own ideas. And I think this is kind of sort of part of the agenda to sort of make the Gnostics into fun-loving pagans and feminists, because I think academia is not that they wanted to uplift the Gnostics, they were useful. It's more like they wanted to broaden Christianity to make it look more inclusive in the early days and make it more open-minded and more philosophical and all that. What did Elaine Pagel say? If Christianity is like kindergarten and Gnosticism is like grad school. But I don't think that's I think that was a false move. And I think it's culminated with Karen King and the whole fiasco with the gospel of Jesus' wife, how that was found to be a forgery, and the whole feminist agenda and the liberal agenda or whatever has gone down the drain. And of course, you've got scholars again like April DeConnick, Dylan Burns, David Brackey, and so forth, who are saying, no, Gnosticism was always a thing. It is its own separate category. There are, as Robert Price says, there are no perfect boxes where you can put an ideology or group. It's always going to be a little bit messy. There's always going to be overlap, but there was such a thing as the Gnostics. And in April's book, I think one of the most key lines that she says, so a lot of good research and lines, she does say the Gnostic texts did not become blasphemous. They were blasphemous from the get-go. In other words, it wasn't like somebody like Irenaeus or Tertullian was looking at things and just like stamped it. You're a heretic. This is blasphemous because we've decided so. No. Their radical spiritual orientation from the beginning was completely subversive to not just early Christianity, but traditional Judaism, paganism. I've given some examples in this vlog. It was radical, the idea that the gods and the representatives and the government and nature and the great chain of being, it was all one big, chain of captivity. And that beyond all of this, there was a alien God that we could make contact with that could transform us into holy beings internally. Well, that was very radical. And that such, you might say, important figures in the Greco-Roman world and even the Jewish world, like the Demiurge and the Archons and other figures, were actually all just turning them into villains was pretty radical. Again, think about Origen and Celsus agreeing on one thing, and that is that you do not make gods into the bad guys because we serve them. We got to worship to them. We got to put our noses up their asses because that is simply how the universe works. That's how it's always worked. It works down the great chain of being to our priests, to our teachers, to our bosses at work, to everything. It is what it is, and the Gnostics were the first to say it ain't, and they've paid through it throughout history, and even today. Well, I'd like to say that people are waking up. They're seeing how the Gnostic sensibility and spiritual world does make sense, that everything we've been told is a lie, and that's pretty much the default place we need to start with and start working our way out. But it's still pretty radical. So, again, it's great to see Aeon Byte growing. It's resounding with people. It's great to see great guests on the show, and I certainly hope to continue with this vibe and this expression. And I hope you've had as much fun as I've been having. In fact, let me check the things and let me check the room. Yeah, it looks like people are still hanging out there. Cool. Well, in that case, what we'll do now is we will end the normal part of the Abraxas brief. I will start taking questions from the forum, and the question part will be included for members in the archive of past shows, as well as patrons at Patreon, as long as it doesn't keep disappearing as everybody exits Patreon. So for those of you here, thank you very much. Thanks for being here, and thanks for being yourself. And now we will get to the Q&A. And yes, nipples for men.